let me introduce Mr. Pier Luigi Sacco. He's from Italy, from Milan and Harvard University at the same time. Signor Luigi, cordialmente. Good morning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be back to Kaunas. I've been there here last time, I think, 10 years ago. And it's spectacular to see how the city is growing up with this project of the capital of culture. I'm really looking forward to what will happen in 2022. So today, we'll speak about, I think, an important perspective in terms of how culture can also change the agenda, yes, of these big, boring institutions in Brussels that, however, I think are at the same time breaking ground towards really, in some sense, refurbishing the role of culture in a much more impactful way, and in particular connecting culture to issues that generally we don't consider as related. And we'll see in a moment that there is especially a document that has been published just 1 year ago, the new European Agenda for Culture, that really makes a sea change from this point of view. And I would really like to draw your attention toward this tiny little document, very simple and unassuming, apparently, but really revolutionary in its implication. The idea is very simple. Generally, when we have to advocate for culture, we try to make the argument that culture is important. And generally what happens is that the only people we manage to convince are the ones who are already convinced. Because all the others say, oh yeah, good, of course culture is fantastic. Well, you know, I have problems. I have infrastructures that are crumbling down. I have problems with the migrant crisis. I have problems with the aging population. So you see, I like your culture, but the problem is that if I put money on a new theater, I am undermining the possibility of providing better health services. So what should I do in your own view? You know, that's the kind of trap we always fall in. So what has happened with this new European Agenda for Culture is simply reverting the problem and starting from, okay, show me your problems. What are the things that really keep you awake at night? And I'll show you that culture can make a difference for those things. So if you move from this perspective, something that felt like, okay, very marginal, very, in some sense, irrelevant for the big issues of the future of Europe, can really have a completely different look. And in particular, this document chooses 3 areas that are clearly central for the future of Europe, and they are health and well-being, social cohesion, and innovation. And in particular, the new strategy of the European Commission on this is to focus on these areas and see how culture makes a difference and how in the future we can really make a contribution in changing the prospects of Europe by connecting to issues that are not generally related to culture, but in which culture can really make the difference. You know, it's a big change. This means that in the future European programs, there will be lots of opportunities to develop this, but in particular, this means, I think, that we can have a completely different level of dialogue with civil society, also with those parts of civil societies that generally think of themselves as not so really interested in culture, if compared to other issues that are felt as more burning. You know, the real problem in the end is that it's not true that there is any single human being that is not interested in culture. The real problem is how we engage with that. Because, I mean, if you tell a good story, everybody will listen. Huh? So, no question, because this is part of our social behavioral programming. Huh? It's really how we have been built in the first place. So the real point is, okay, let's make the stories more compelling, and let's make this story. And this does not mean that what we told so far was not compelling. But the problem is that we have to consider different regimes of cultural production that function with different rules. Most of what we've been doing in cultural production so far falls into the so-called context of the patronage regime, which is very important and very nice. In Europe, is all about patronage, and of course also public policy is patronage. It's just another form of patronage. But you know what? The problem of patronage is the fact that there is the patron inviting somebody to his or her table. It was like this in the ancient Rome, it was like this in the Renaissance, it's still like this today, when we have the public patron, which is the state. The problem is that for many people, crossing psychologically the threshold of the museum or of the theater is scary, because they felt as invited to the home of someone else. Of course, that's not our intention. The idea is that we want museums that are as welcoming as possible. But the fact that despite 100 years of intense practice in public policy in the cultural sphere, this is still a problem. And this is a problem because in some sense it's part of the nature of the patronage regime. Because in the patronage regime there are the experts and the artists that make the rules. And people have to learn, in some sense, how to cope with these rules to access certain forms of meaning, which again is fantastic. I'm not saying this in a pejorative sense, but clearly requires a certain type of attitude and a certain type of motivation. Of course, there is another regime in which we did exactly the contrary. It's culture and creative industries, in which we go towards the public and ask to the public, okay, what do you want? And I deliver what you want. Again, fantastic. But the problem is that by asking people what do you want, generally we have to focus on what people are relatively already familiar with and not particularly scared by. So it's very difficult to have radical innovation in a field in which the starting point is what do you want. And this means that, again, it's very important to have engagement and entertainment through the culture and creative industries and fantastic ways of engaging people with culture. But again, this also has some limitation. There is, however, a third regime that is emerging today, and this, I think, is particularly interesting for what we are discussing, especially in terms of the social impact of culture, which is a regime that is emerging now, not only because we have these fancy technologies that enable us to produce content, all of us, and to deliver content wherever, but because this is really creating for the first time in the cultural history of the humankind a situation, or better, not in the first time, but in the first time since we invented the role of the artist in the first place, which is a relatively recent discovery, but it has shaped basically all our cultural history that is recorded. The point is that today, for the first time, we are renegotiating the relationship that once was absolutely out of question between the producer and the user of contents. Today, people are interminglingly taking all these roles all the time with ease in a natural way, and they want to be involved in an active, propositional way, and not simply they want to be the public, the audience. This is why I'm particularly uneasy with the notion of audience development. I don't think this is the problem. The problem is the audience. The problem is that if we keep on treating people like the audience, in some sense, you're missing the point. And think, was just mentioned, Game of Thrones has just finished. But you know, for example, that there was a sort of rebellion, mass rebellion, about the fact that the last season was not up to expectation for some people. Or what did people say? We want the series to be rewritten. So this is really something that has to do with an attitude that is no longer the attitude of the audience clapping the hands or booing, but it's really much about, I want to be part of the story. I have an idea of how this story could be told. And why should not be engaging with these people? And this is the new regime we are in. And it's a novelty. And as we will see, it's gonna, in some sense, restructure the way we think of culture as a societal impact sphere. At the same time, I'm not saying that this regime is replacing the other ones. The real point is that we are going towards a world in which the patronage regime, the culture and creative industry regime, and this new open platform regime coexist, and we have to use them flexibly like an orchestra, like a menu of possibilities. But in particular, what I want to stress is the fact that if we want to think of culture as a platform for societal impact, first of all, we have to acknowledge that culture has an incredible capacity to shape human behavior. This thing seems a platitude. It's obvious if you think of it. But it's not obvious at all from the policy point of view. Because from the policy point of view, the idea that culture changes behavior is irrelevant. No policymaker is seriously thinking of this. But if you look at Greek theater, for example, what is Greek theater ultimately? Is a, in some sense, device for public decision making in which people are led into considering certain burning issues of the time and reaching an emotional climax. And this climax is called catharsis, through which they recognize that this train of emotions put you in the condition to look at the problem from a different point of view and to activate a collective deliberation to tackle the problem in a different way. Tell me if this is not behavioral programming. But we have just given a Nobel Prize for economics to very respectable scholars that spoke about nudging, spoke about the fact that, let's say, if you paint a little flea on the ceramics of your pissoir, men will be more careful in aiming at the, in some sense, aiming at the target when they do their things. And okay, certainly these are nice ways to condition human behavior, and you can have all sorts of nudging, but this is fresh water compared to culture. So the point is, shall we start taking culture seriously for the fact that culture is already affecting so profoundly our behavior, our emotions, our cognition, and acknowledging that this can really be transformational when we think of culture as a way to address our societal challenges in a completely different way. First of all, this requires an evolution of the notion of participation. So in the patronage regime, participation is very much about co-optation. Come here. I mean, now I'll train you how to use a museum. Or now I'll put you in the condition to listen to a classical music concert without getting asleep. Okay? But this is really co-optation. In the cultural and creative industry, participation is about market access. You can go to the movie theater if you can pay for it. And again, this requires certain types of conditions that are not for everybody. But what's happening in the new regime is that participation is very much about empowerment. We are in situations in which we don't need to have money to access, and not necessarily we have to have the precondition to appreciate certain types of experience. What's happening today is building together the conditions for certain experiences to make sense. What you see, for example, in this image is the School of Narrative Dance, which is a project by Italian artist Marinella Senatore. And it's all about engaging a community and using dance as a way to develop the community together, to say what we decide to say together. And you are creating the conditions for this in the very moment in which you engage people. So there's no barrier, because you are getting in the position of setting the rules. And you don't have to learn the rules that have been set by someone else. This reflects in a very important way in terms of aesthetic regimes. Because in the patronage era, we have been focusing on the idea, very important, still today, of culture as elevation. And culture as disinterested appreciation of the experience. This is basically Kant, is the critique of judgment, is the idea that if you are in this condition, appreciate an experience, this has no practical value, but has, of course, an enormous impact on how you see the world, and so on and so forth. But it's important that you are, in some sense, disinterested in this judgment, and you are elevated by the experience, okay? In the cultural and creative industry, what is the criterion for aesthetic success? It's not that you are elevated, but it's that you are engaged. If you go see a movie, even if from the point of view of the movie critic, this is not a masterpiece, if you are there, stuck there, and completely engaged into the experience, that's an aesthetic success. And so it's okay like this. So we do not ask if Jurassic Park will enter the history of movies from the patronage point of view, considering movies as artworks. Jurassic Park is a success if people feel engaged. And when they get out, they are completely enthusiastic about the experience, period. This is the aesthetic canon of culture and creative industry. But what's the aesthetic canon of the third regime we are entering now? Is connecting to a community. Not as a form of participation, but as the aesthetic standard. So you are aesthetically accomplished if you build trust with the community and develop together a certain thing. What is the consequence of this? If you consider the issue from the point of view of disinterested judgment, any kind of further ulterior motive you attach to culture is in some sense missing the point. You are instrumentalizing culture, because culture is about culture, period. It's the experience that you make. But if the aesthetic canon is connecting to something, the fact that you have a societal impact is not only not instrumentalizing culture, but it's part of the poetics. You are poetically accomplished if you have an impact. And this is the reason why today we see a new generation of artists that are doing exactly this. For example, Tania Bruguera's notion of arte útil is very much about this. I am the artist, I'm at your service. Okay, what can we do together that is useful to you as a community? And this is the aesthetic result. It's much more important than whether or not you produce together is formally refined, could be hanged to a wall of a museum by traditional standards. It's very much about what we do together as the new aesthetic canon. What is the consequence of this? That having an impact is not transgressing the boundaries of culture in this new regime, but is very much about putting it to consequence. It's really deploying the potential of culture. And the point of the agenda for culture is exactly considering areas of impact in which we can make the difference. So consider the first, innovation. If you look at the ranking of EU countries in terms of innovation performance, and if you look at countries, the same countries, from the point of view of level of cultural participation, what do you notice? That basically the rankings are the same. The countries where people participate culturally the most are also the countries in which you are, as a system, more innovative. This is correlation and not causation. But, interestingly, what kind of explanation do we have for this? Very simply, the fact that when you engage with culture, you are constantly in touch with new provoking ideas. Cultural innovation is irritating because it challenges your preconditions, your prejudices sometimes. Generally, when we look at something innovative from the cultural point of view, we don't feel we are too stupid for it. We think that the artist is too stupid for us. Think of Duchamp. I mean, you see a pissoir on a pedestal, and they say, this is a work of art. And you say, come on. And then you go out angry, and you go to a Gucci store, and you buy a pair of shoes for 700 euros because they are on a pedestal, which is exactly the same display, exactly the same device that you thought made no sense 5 minutes before. So the real problem is that adapting to cultural innovation and appreciating, understanding how subtle can be the way in which this changes our attitude of the world is a difficult exercise, but at the same time is an exercise that we can do without risking too much. So the more people get, let's say, accustomed to this idea of dealing with new, irritating, strange ideas, the more the actual novelty comes when you are on your professional place, like, for example, as a bank officer having to design a loan to a new entrepreneur for a technology you've never seen before. At this point, you can react in two different ways. And one is, I don't see what this is, I don't understand, please go away. Or, okay, let's give this guy a chance and let's try to understand if these things really mean something, even if I don't know what it is. Probably it's my fault. And this is the point. The capacity to innovate as a region or as a country depends on this, not being scared by new ideas. So, accessing culture, exposing people to new ideas is the best way to create the conditions for innovation. And this is one way in which culture can become a platform for pre-innovation. And this is very much about putting people in the condition of struggling with new ideas without being scared. And this is one first fundamental area in which culture can be transformational, especially if Europe wants to catch up with the innovation race that is today global and is challenging our future. Of course, in terms of actual mechanism through which innovation can spread over or resist, there are so many possibilities. Some of them today we know, some of them we know less. For example, one intriguing thing is that attitudes to innovation seem to be contagious. If you are, let's say, in a region in which people tend to be innovative, nearby regions tend to be, in some sense, affected by this through a contagion mechanism simply because people move and talk with each other. So it's extremely important, for example, to understand how can we create a social dynamics of innovation through a social dynamics of cultural participation. And this means, for example, coordinating with our neighbors in developing certain types of cultural policies. So, for example, the idea that Kaunas as a culture capital, not simply at the city level, but at the district level, is a very good idea, because it's very much about innovation contagion. If you create, let's say, a beacon of new ideas in Kaunas city, but nothing in the surrounding, of course, in some sense, you are already self-defeating what you're trying to do. And this is one point. But a point where things are even clearer now is the relationship with health and well-being. This is really becoming a big thing. And the reason is that we have today a fantastic stream of clinical research that is explaining to us that not only people who have a regular access to cultural participation live longer, on average 2.5 years longer than people who don't, but they are much happier from the point of view of their quality of life. Why this thing should have a societal impact? Very simply, think, for example, of, let's say, elderly people. What happens generally to elderly people when they retire? They lock themselves in their home, very little relationships with other people. They get ill very easily. They go to the hospital. They take a lot of medicines. How much of this could be avoidable if simply these people felt better? And how culture could contribute to this? Imagine that by inviting elderly people to have a regular access to cultural opportunity, which is not necessarily and only going to the museum, it could be singing together, dancing together, developing stories together. I mean, imagine that this is causing, let's say, a 5% drop in the amount, in the rate of medicalization, so how many medicines they take, or hospitalization. This will be more than enough to finance all the culture you can dream of. Saving resources, making people better off, and financing culture. So this is very much about impact. Isn't that poetic? I think it is. And if artists start thinking in these terms, how much they can connect to people who would never dream of entering a contemporary museum, for example. And after this, they would probably rush to the museum because now they have a reason to do this. And these are, for example, the effects of a couple of experiences like listening to classical music concerts as developed by my research group on a representative sample of the Italian population. The scale that you see there is the so-called general psychological well-being scale, which measures how people feel physically and emotionally in a certain moment. A couple points difference is a big difference in terms of how you feel. What we see here is that by listening to classical music from never in a year to once a month causes a difference of 12 points, which is something that basically no other human activity could think of doing. And the effects of this can be absolutely spectacular. At the same time, how many people think that classical music is an option for them? Too little. So this is an enormous possibility. This is what happens, for example, for theater. Not such spectacular. There is a plateau, so to speak, and this is typical. Most of the activities are like this. It's not that they grow and grow, but still in the case of theater, we have a 6-point difference from not going to theater and going to theater with a certain frequency. And most of the time, this is what happens. So that's particularly important. At the same time, what we see here briefly is a snapshot of an experiment that we have been doing, and this is really challenging, in terms of simply evaluating the effect of a single visit to a heritage site. So, I mean, what can a single visit to a heritage site change for people? So we picked 100 people, and before and after this visit, that this is quite a visit, I should say, because it's a church in Italy which has an enormous vault, frescoed vault, the biggest elliptical vault in Europe, and you have to climb up to 7 meters from the ground to look at, of course, not just climbing, I mean with the stairs, and to look at the frescoes from a close distance. We measure before and after the visit two things: the level of psychological well-being and the level of salivary cortisol. So how much was in the saliva of the cortisol hormone, which is the hormone of stress, that measures one of the most important pathogenic factors that we have. It happens that cortisol varies throughout the day, even if we do nothing. It's high in the morning and lower across the day. But the point is that we know what is the decay, how much it lowers across the day. So the point is, how can we show whether or not there is a difference from this point of view? It turned out that this simple visit not only significantly increased the level of psychological well-being, but dropped the level of salivary cortisol much lower than expected if people did nothing. So this means that we can have medical consequence from the simple fact of visiting an heritage site with a certain attitude. And I'm quickly going to conclude, just to give you an example of what can be done. For example, if we consider seriously issues like empathy. This is the result of an exercise of social reading for educational and health professionals that were invited to read together on a digital platform that is customized to the purpose, the so-called Betwheel platform, that, by the way, has also partners in Lithuania, as far as I understand. In this case, of collective reading of let's say, the medical novel par excellence, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The idea was, okay, since physicians tend to be not so empathic with their patients, can we, for example, improve through social reading their empathic attitudes? What we measure here is the so-called basic empathy scale, which is a scale with 3 different subscales that measure different aspects of empathy. What we saw in measuring the empathy before and after the exercise of collective social reading of the novel was that, irrespectively of the levels, the so-called internal correlation of the 3 subscales increased spectacularly. What does it mean? It means that, of course, you cannot change the empathic attitude of people with reading one novel. But what you can do is to make them much more coherently empathic. What changes is their attitude. So when they read the next novel, they will be prepared to be empathic much more. So you will not find the effect in one reading, but you can prepare the scene by putting people into the idea of reading with a certain attitude. So these are just examples, and then I really conclude. Think, for example, of what can be done in this regard to address one of the most burning political issues today, the migrant crisis. We know that the migrant crisis is very much about people being scared of the other, of somebody you don't know. What are the regions in Europe that are most xenophobic? The one with the most migrants? No, the opposite, the ones with the least migrants. And the real point is that, as we were told from the previous keynote, the problem is that we stereotype people. The problem is that the more and more they become real people, the less and less we are scared by them, by the simple fact that they are within a certain type of box. We cannot find today of any activity other than culture that can really reshape this kind of perception in ways that create a real communication. So the point is, we need to use more and more the possibility of collaboration between social sciences and the arts and culture in working together, not only in a more poetically impactful way of deploying the possibilities of culture, but also in terms of measuring and telling them. Because this is the only way to really make the new agenda for culture happen, and showing policymakers what actually happens in the minds and the hearts of people where certain things are experienced. This can be done. This is not a violation of the sacred status of culture. This is simply a way of understanding better why culture is so important to us. And so I think that especially projects like European capitals of culture can become laboratories to do this and really make a change. Thank you very much.
Pier Luigi Sacco.